The morning somebody stole my truck keys. I honestly thought I was walking into one of those ridiculous neighborhood arguments people laugh about later over a barbecue. The kind where somebody complains about mailbox paint or the height of your grass. Instead, before the sun was fully over the trees, a woman I'd barely spoken to turned my own driveway into what she believed would become my public humiliation. And less than 20 minutes later, she was calling 911, telling dispatch that I was a dangerous man. The funny part is, she had absolutely no idea who she was talking about. And looking back now, I almost wish she had simply left a nasty note on my windshield, because what happened after that changed far more than either of us expected. My name is Daniel Mercer, and after 27 years in law enforcement, I figured I'd earned a little peace. My wife, Emily, agreed. We had spent decades living around sirens, late-night phone calls, emergency meetings, and holidays interrupted by things nobody plans for. When retirement finally became a real conversation, we bought a ranch-style home just outside a little community called Silver Creek Meadows. It wasn't flashy, just enough land to breathe, enough distance between neighbors to hear birds instead of traffic, and enough quiet that I could drink coffee on the porch without wondering who needed me next. We knew there was an HOA. Honestly, I didn't care. Every neighborhood seems to have one now. I figured I'd mow my lawn, wave at neighbors, pay the annual dues, and stay out of everybody else's business. That plan lasted exactly 3 weeks. I started noticing little things. A letter because my trailer sat in my driveway for 22 hours instead of 24. Another because someone claimed my mailbox flowers weren't on the approved landscaping list. Then one afternoon, an older neighbor named Frank wandered over while I was changing the oil in my truck. He leaned against my fence and quietly said, "Don't take it personal. Vivian likes reminding people she runs this place." I laughed. Runs it? Isn't she just the HOA president? Frank looked both ways before answering. That's what the paperwork says. Then he walked away without another word. At the time, I thought he was exaggerating. Looking back, I realized it was probably the most honest warning anyone could have given me. Vivian Holloway had lived there nearly 15 years. She wasn't rich enough to impress anyone, powerful enough to actually control anything, or important outside the neighborhood. But inside Silver Creek Meadows, she carried herself like a governor. She drove around in a spotless white SUV with the HOA logo on the doors, wore expensive sunglasses even on cloudy mornings, and somehow always appeared exactly where someone was supposedly violating community rules. She never smiled unless somebody apologized to her. The first time we actually spoke, she walked onto my property without asking, clipboard in hand, and circled my pickup like she was inspecting stolen government property. "That's quite a large truck," she said. "Fits in the garage," I answered. "Then perhaps you should keep it there." I smiled politely. "I like seeing it outside." She didn't smile back. "The board will review that." She turned around and left without another word. Emily came out after she was gone and asked, "Should I be worried?" I shrugged. People like that usually get bored. That turned out to be my biggest mistake. People who crave control don't get bored. They escalate. 3 mornings later, I walked outside carrying my coffee and nearly dropped the mug. Vivian was standing beside my truck. My driver's door was open. She wasn't breaking into it anymore because she'd already finished. She was twirling my keys around one finger like they belonged to her. "Morning," she said casually. I stared for a second because my brain refused to accept what my eyes were seeing. "What exactly are you doing?" She lifted the keys a little higher. "This vehicle is currently in violation of community parking standards." I blinked. "So you stole my keys?" "Confiscated," she corrected with a smug little grin. "There's a difference." I actually laughed because I thought she was joking. Nobody could seriously believe an HOA had authority to seize someone's personal property. "Vivian, hand me my keys." She folded her arms. "Not until the truck is brought into compliance. It's parked in my own driveway, which is visible from the street." That's generally how driveways work. For just a split second, I thought maybe she'd realize how ridiculous this sounded. Instead, she took one slow step backward, reached into her pocket, pulled out her phone, and dialed 911 while looking directly at me. Then she said words I'll never forget. "Yes, I'm the HOA president. I have an aggressive homeowner threatening me after I attempted to enforce community regulations. I don't feel safe." I didn't move. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't even take another step. I simply stood there, holding a cooling cup of coffee while my own truck keys dangled from someone else's hand. Curtains started moving across the street. Garage doors cracked open. Cell phones appeared in windows. Emily stepped outside behind me and whispered, "Daniel, what is she doing?" I slowly exhaled and answered without taking my eyes off Vivian, making the biggest mistake of her life. Vivian kept talking to the dispatcher as if I wasn't standing 10 feet away listening to every word. "He's getting closer. He's becoming more confrontational. I need officers immediately." It would have been almost impressive if it weren't so reckless. Emily looked at me, then back at Vivian, completely confused. "You're literally standing still," she whispered. "I know," I said quietly. "Just let her finish." After nearly 3 decades in law enforcement, I'd learned something most people never get the chance to understand. The loudest person in a conflict is rarely the one controlling it. Sometimes the smartest move is simply letting someone continue digging the hole they're already standing in. Vivian finally ended the call and smiled at me like she'd already won. "You'll learn today that nobody is above community rules," I almost answered, but instead I took another sip of my coffee. She mistook my silence for fear. That was mistake number 2. Within 6 or 7 minutes, I heard tires rolling onto our street. 2 patrol SUVs entered the neighborhood. Lights flashing, but no sirens. Several neighbors stepped onto their lawns pretending to water flowers or collect mail even though everyone knew they were there to watch the show. Frank stood across the street with his hands shoved into his pockets. He caught my eye and slowly shook his head like he'd seen this movie before. Deputy Kyle Jensen climbed out first. Young guy. Probably early 30s. Good deputy, level-headed. Someone I'd worked with for years. Behind him came Deputy Maria Ortiz, equally professional and impossible to intimidate. Vivian immediately rushed toward them before either deputy had even shut the vehicle doors. "Thank goodness you're here," she announced dramatically. This man became hostile after I sighted his vehicle. Kyle hadn't looked at me yet. He was still listening to dispatch information through his shoulder radio while Vivian continued talking over him. He intimidated me. He approached aggressively. I feared for my safety. Maria finally raised one hand. "Ma'am, give us one moment." Vivian looked irritated that she wasn't immediately being treated like the victim she'd imagined herself becoming. Kyle finally turned toward me. For exactly 1 second, his face remained completely professional. Then recognition hit him. His eyes widened just slightly before instinct took over. His shoulders straightened. "Morning, Sheriff." The entire street went silent. You could almost hear people stop breathing. Vivian blinked once, then frowned. "Sheriff?" Kyle nodded without taking his eyes off me. "Good morning, Sheriff Mercer." Maria looked over too, smiled politely and said, "Morning, sir." Vivian actually laughed. "Oh, please. That's cute. Are you two friends?" Neither deputy answered her. Emily glanced at me with the tiniest grin because she knew exactly what was about to happen. I never wore my uniform at home. I didn't advertise my position. Most neighbors simply assumed I was another retired guy who liked old trucks and black coffee. That suited me just fine. Authority isn't something you should have to introduce yourself with. Vivian crossed her arms. "Well, are you going to arrest him?" Kyle looked at her carefully. "Ma'am, before we discuss anything else, I'd like to know why you're holding someone else's vehicle keys." Her confidence slipped just enough for me to notice. "They're evidence." "Evidence of what?" Maria asked. "A parking violation." Neither deputy moved. Kyle spoke slowly, almost gently. "The HOA authorizes confiscating private property?" Vivian hesitated. "Well, not exactly. But, did the owner give you permission to enter his vehicle?" "No." "Did you have a warrant?" "Of course not." "Did you have any legal authority whatsoever?" Vivian opened her mouth, then closed it. She looked toward the gathering neighbors as if someone else might rescue her answer. "Nobody did." Finally, she pointed at me. "He's trying to twist this." I spoke for the first time since the deputies arrived. "Deputy Jensen, would you ask Ms. Holloway one question for me?" Kyle nodded. "Certainly, Sheriff." I looked directly at Vivian. "Ask her if she opened my truck door before or after removing the keys." Vivian immediately answered without thinking. "After, because I had to check whether there were any additional violations inside." The second those words left her mouth, Maria quietly reached for her notebook. She didn't make a scene. She simply started writing. Vivian noticed. "Why are you writing that?" Maria answered calmly. "Because you just admitted entering someone else's vehicle without permission." Frank let out the smallest laugh across the street before quickly pretending to cough. Vivian turned red. "You're taking his side because he's your boss." Kyle shook his head. "No, ma'am. We're following state law. We'd do exactly the same thing if this belonged to anyone else." She wasn't listening anymore. Her entire worldview depended on believing the HOA outranked common sense. She pointed toward my truck. That vehicle violates our neighborhood standards. Maybe, Kyle answered. That's a civil matter. Entering the vehicle isn't. The words landed harder than she expected. For the first time that morning, she looked uncertain. Then, instead of backing down, she doubled down. Fine. Then I want him charged with threatening me. Maria looked up from her notebook. Can you describe the threat? Vivian hesitated. He stared at me. There was a long silence. Anything else? Maria asked. His tone was intimidating. Kyle glanced toward my untouched coffee cup still sitting on the porch railing. Did he move toward you? Well, no. Raise his voice? No. Touch you? No. Touch you? No. Use threatening language? No. Kyle looked around the street. Does anyone here have video? 4 different neighbors raised their hands almost instantly. Apparently everyone had started recording the moment Vivian dialed 911. One younger homeowner stepped forward. I've got everything from the beginning. Another older couple spoke up. Our security camera faces the driveway. Frank added, mine too. Vivian slowly turned around and realized something she hadn't considered. Every witness she'd expected to support her had actually recorded her instead. Maria collected names while Kyle asked if everyone would voluntarily preserve the footage. They all agreed without hesitation. Then something happened that changed the direction of the entire morning. A woman I'd never met walked across the street carrying a folder. She introduced herself as Linda Brooks from 2 houses down. Sheriff, I don't know if this matters, but she did something similar to my husband last year. Different situation, same behavior. She handed Kyle copies of emails she'd saved. Then another resident stepped forward. Then another. Complaints, warning letters, security footage, photos, stories that sounded strangely familiar. It became painfully obvious this wasn't an isolated incident. Vivian hadn't suddenly lost her judgment that morning. She'd been pushing boundaries for years because nobody had ever challenged her. Kyle quietly leaned toward me. Sir, this may end up being bigger than today's call. I nodded. I think you're right. Vivian finally realized the conversation was slipping away from her. Everyone here is conspiring against me. Frank smiled for the first time all morning. No, Vivian, we're just finally talking. She looked directly at me, in replacing confidence. You set this up. I couldn't help smiling. No, you did. All I did was walk outside to drive my truck. She stared at me for several long seconds, still clutching my keys like they were the last piece of authority she had left. Then Kyle calmly extended his hand. Ma'am, I'll need you to return Mr. Mercer's property now. For a moment, I honestly thought she was going to refuse. Instead, she slowly placed the keys into Kyle's hand. He immediately turned and handed them back to me. They felt strangely heavy, not because of what they weighed, but because I realized this entire situation had stopped being about a truck almost the moment she dialed 911. It had become about something much bigger. The moment someone convinced themselves that having a title inside a neighborhood somehow placed them above the law. And as more neighbors began walking toward my driveway carrying folders, flash drives, printed emails, and years of bottled-up frustration, I had a feeling this investigation was only getting started, and Silver Creek Meadows was about to learn just how expensive unchecked power could become. By the following Monday, what had started as one ridiculous argument over a parked truck had turned into the busiest internal investigation our county had seen involving an HOA in years. I deliberately removed myself from every official decision because the complaint involved me personally, and the last thing I wanted was anyone claiming I had used my position for revenge. The case was assigned to another division. County attorneys reviewed every statement, and investigators collected hours of security footage from around Silver Creek Meadows. What surprised me wasn't the evidence against Vivian. It was how many people had simply been waiting for someone to finally listen. Families who had lived there for years described being threatened with fines that never existed. Elderly homeowners talked about feeling bullied into paying unnecessary fees because they didn't know the rules. And one young couple admitted they'd almost sold their house after months of intimidation over imaginary violations. Every story sounded slightly different, yet they all carried the same theme. Nobody challenged her because everyone assumed fighting back would only make life harder. A few weeks later, the HOA held what became the most crowded community meeting in its history. Emily asked whether I planned to attend. I smiled and shook my head. Not unless somebody invites me. About an hour after the meeting started, my phone buzzed. It was Frank. You might want to come over, he said with a laugh I hadn't heard from him before. You're going to want to see this. When I walked into the clubhouse, the atmosphere felt completely different from the first weeks after we moved there. People weren't whispering anymore. They were asking questions. Real questions. Financial records were being projected onto a screen. Board members were being challenged on procedures they had ignored for years. Homeowners who had barely spoken during previous meetings were now standing confidently, reading sections of the bylaws aloud. Vivian sat at the front table looking exhausted, no longer speaking with that absolute certainty she carried like a badge. When one resident asked whether the board had ever approved confiscating personal property, the room fell silent. There was no policy. There never had been. Another homeowner asked why so many violation notices had been issued without proper votes. Nobody answered. Then an older veteran stood up, looked around the room, and quietly said something I'll probably remember for the rest of my life. The problem was never the rules. The problem was that we stopped questioning the people enforcing them. You could almost feel the room change. Before the meeting ended, homeowners voted to remove Vivian from the board, approved an independent audit of the HOA's practices, and established new oversight procedures so no single person could exercise that kind of unchecked authority again. Nobody applauded when the vote passed. There was no celebration, just relief. A few days later, I was washing my truck when a familiar white SUV slowly pulled into my driveway. Vivian stepped out alone. She looked smaller somehow, not physically, but emotionally, as though all the confidence she'd borrowed from a title had disappeared with it. She stood there quietly for several seconds before speaking. I came to apologize. I didn't answer right away. She looked down at the driveway where everything had started weeks earlier. I convinced myself I was protecting the neighborhood, she admitted. Somewhere along the way, I forgot I was supposed to be serving the people who lived here. I appreciated the honesty, even if it came late. Power has a strange way of changing people, I said, especially when nobody tells them no. She nodded, thanked me for listening, and drove away. That was the last conversation we ever had. Today my truck still sits in the same driveway every morning. I still drink coffee on the porch with Emily. Frank still waves every afternoon while walking his dog. And the neighborhood is quieter now than when we first arrived. Not because everybody suddenly agrees on everything, but because people finally understand that respect cannot be enforced through intimidation. Rules matter. Communities matter. Accountability matters even more. Looking back, I don't think the biggest mistake Vivian made was taking my truck keys. It wasn't calling 911 either. Her biggest mistake was believing that authority comes from a title instead of integrity. And when someone starts confusing those two things, the fall is usually only a matter of time. Now I'm curious what you think. If someone in your neighborhood crossed that line, would you have handled it differently? Or do you think I should have confronted her much sooner instead of letting events unfold? Let me know in the comments because stories like this always spark strong opinions. And if you enjoyed this one, don't forget to like, subscribe, and share it with someone who's ever dealt with an HOA or anyone who thought they were above the law. Your perspective might be the next great discussion.